And in the commercial, they actually talk about the key value proposition that you heard about, right? So what did it do to Aflac Incorporated? Was it successful? Marketing people love this example. They say, look, brand awareness, 2% in the target market in 1999. We got it to 80% in 2001. And then they continued to having more and more of these commercials, and they got it to 85%. Company revenue shot up from about 555 million in 1999 to about 712 million in 2000 and 919 million in 2001. And again, an attribution analysis showed that most of that was due to just this line of commercials, right? So how do you evaluate the financial success of such a commercial? What is the return on duck investment, as I say, right? So first of all, if you just attribute the full lift in awareness to the duck commercial, so from 2 to 85, you end up with this enormous increase, 3,000% increase in awareness. They got more sales leads, people calling to try to get information about this in the first 2 weeks of 2000, when this aired, than in the 2 years combined before. And then, of course, we have this revenue increase, 28% immediately and 66% over a few years. What people in marketing didn't understand is how expensive this campaign was. So everybody loved the commercials. They did more and more. And over the 6 years, they spent $450 million on this campaign. So when a new CMO came in 2006, you can imagine what he said, right? He said, shut the duck up. This is going to be way too expensive. Really prove to me that in the long term, you have increased the brand value by as much as 450 million. So a very typical example of things that I've worked in. This is a repetition from previous slides. You know that your bosses, chief executive officers, chief financial officers, more and more demand marketing accountability. And what they typically mean is demonstrate the value of what you do in marketing to the brand, to my financial performance. When you talk to companies in the Sabanja holdings, all of the general Muderu, all of the managers are talking about their EBITDA, right? How can you increase my earnings before taxes? And that's a very strong measure that they share with their marketing people. This is also repetition, but just to show you that we can speak the language of financial people within marketing. So typically in marketing, we build these market-based assets. We show that we have better channel relations. A great example, Sony in Eurasia. So Sony figured out that retailers of electronics are extremely hard hit during any recession. You all remember the recession of 2001 here in Turkey, right? So the big companies like Sony and Samsung, they wouldn't even tell retailers what they would charge as a wholesale price the next day. So complete uncertainty. What happens in 2006, 2008? Sony goes to retailers and says, well, there may be a recession coming, but we will guarantee these wholesale prices for the coming weeks and months. So better channel relations. What do they hope to achieve as market performance? That any time they have a new product, and that happens a lot in your markets, that retailers will give them a lot more shelf space, will have their salespeople talk a lot more about the products. So if you get better channel relations, it shows in faster accelerated profits, something that John was talking about. And of course, financially, that shows in the fact that you can accelerate cash flows. The same goes for brand equity. A lot of brand equity is the fact that you can charge a higher price. So if your product goes and sells in France, for instance, and people pay a certain price, and then you say, well, this is my brand, or even harsher, this is a Turkish brand, are people willing to pay more or less for your brand, right, for the same product? So if that happens, of course, you're enhancing cash flows. And that's the language that finance loves to hear. Customer equity, you have a share premium, people love to buy from you, it typically stabilizes your cash flows. So some updates on the research that David was showing you is that in the current recession, yes, companies that spend more on marketing typically outperform those that don't. But it's specifically helpful to have a great brand and very loyal customers to stabilize your cash flows. So when a recession hits, if you don't feel strongly about your brand, you can easily switch to a cheaper alternative. But when you're really passionate about the brand, think about Apple, think about telecom companies in Turkey, then you stick with them. And then finally, of course, having a lot of great business networks, right? Knowing where to outsource your production to China or to some other country or to another region in Turkey, that helps reduce your service costs and, of course, will increase the residual value of your cash flows. So most of the things we built, let's say, within marketing as market-based assets, immediately impact market performance, which increases cash flows. The tough thing, I think, in most of our businesses is to show and demonstrate, to quantify how that happens. One example that I love to give, so again, I was in the US in '99 when Honda launches the Odyssey product. It had a minivan before, and the only thing it did in '99 was to install this wonderful, cheap innovation of foldable back row seats that are now standards in all minivans, I believe, right? So the competitors had the information. Chrysler could do it, everybody could do it, but their market research was showing that it increases the noise in a car. So Chrysler was saying, we're not going to put it into our minivans because we think that consumers won't like the noise. Honda marketeers said, no, we'll put it in. Our research showed that this is going to be fantastic. And what I show here, so this is the introduction of the 99 model in October 98. This is the dealer gross margin on Honda Odysseys. So talking about price premium, right? So how much the dealers get for your car went from around $1,000 to $3,500 and stayed that high for the coming years, even when competitors matched the innovation. So great example of how one thing in marketing that you can do, and in this case got imitated by competitors very quickly, increases the price premium. Honda did not want to give me their price premiums. Companies rarely give you their costs unless they're very transparent, but they assure me that their profit went up in about the same way as the retailers did. Did this impact the Honda financial value, the market capitalization? So that's a study I did in the car industry. And so, of course, the Honda Odyssey is just one part of their car business. The car business is just one part of the whole of the Honda group, as you know. So what I showed in the paper is, this is the number of weeks. And now on the chart is the firm value of Honda as market capitalization. So how much do they trade for as shares times their stock price? And you see with the introduction of the Honda Odyssey, the stock market didn't really know. There was some, and this is the significant lines which we like to put in econometrics, there was some significant increase in Honda market value of the whole company at the time of just this one innovation. But investors were really looking at how consumers were going to react, right? So it took about 8 weeks of consumer positive reaction before investors had bid up the value of the company to its stable new higher value. So this is a chart that I love to give to my finance colleagues, like Kenneth French in Dartmouth, and say, look, the investors may be very smart, but they don't know some information. In this case, they didn't know right away what the consumer reaction would be. And so there's a great opportunity for us to communicate that to them. So financial markets are very smart, but they don't react right away. The same thing what I did in America was to analyze the impact of all their price promotions and rebates, right? So General Motors came up with employee financing, that you get the same price on a car as their employees. And so what you typically see in the American car market is that having lots of price promotions and rebates bids up your stock price right away. Because everybody knows you have a lot of fixed costs, you have to get rid of the cars in your inventory, but it reduces your financial value in the long run. Because ultimately you're training your customers to buy on deal, and every single year, talking to GM, Chrysler, and Ford, they told me, we just have to give these crazy $8,000 rebates on a sport utility vehicle, only on the old model. Because you will see in October we'll come out with our new model, and it's going to be fantastic. It's going to blow the competition away, and we will never discount our new model. And every October the competition was not stupid, and also came up with great models, and the market share stayed about the same, or even declined in the case of General Motors, and they had to discount again because they trained the consumers to buy on a discount, right? So contrast that with a company like BMW, which had me wait for 3 months for a car, which only works on order at the time, where they got their price premiums to be much higher and got a lot less people asking for discounts. So it's very tough to measure brand value. I've done this now in the US, in Europe, and in Turkey for several years. What you typically get in companies is that the returns are too vague, right? So how, even with an econometric model, how can people in your company actually trust? And so chief executive officers and financial officers are very wary of what I call brand babble. And I see a lot of that in Turkish marketing departments. So they say things like, well, this is going to be really cool. We need to be #1 on Facebook, right? Facebook is very big in Turkey, as you know, third Facebook nation in the world. So if only we had the #1 automotive site on Facebook, it's going to be fantastic. And they spend 30% of their budget on it, and then they find out that their test drives don't increase. And if you don't get people to test drive your cars, the sales also don't increase, right? So they do very cool stuff, but how does it contribute to getting people in the cars and to actually buy them and to your price premium? So you have to show that what you do, especially if it's a big investment, actually contributes to the bottom line, short term and long term. So how do you do that? You just have to track how the brand plays in the marketplace. And there's a lot of great data available also in emerging markets to help you do that. And so, also citing Tim Ambler, an asset is accumulated goodwill about a brand that hasn't necessarily translated into any revenue yet, but you can quantify, and you can get pretty close to what the value of it will be. And I always say in marketing, and finance people hate me for that, but I always say in marketing, it's better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong, right? So even if marketing is the toughest job in a company, and I know it is, you have your competitors doing stuff, your customers, the government is changing regulations, you can get pretty accurate and you can get better and better over time if you start measuring now and you see which measures are useful for your company and you start to update them. So the brand terminology depends on the functions. Chief financial officers typically want to measure this financial asset. The head of your marketing, or the general müdür typically in Turkey, wants to measure how branding affects behavior. Whereas people in the marketing department are much more interested in what can I do to impact how consumers feel and think about me. So this is the language you have to bring together. And so this is and it's very similar to what John and David have shown, right? So if you think about your market into what the US marketers do, so marketing builds brand value in the minds and the hearts of the consumers. So marketing is typically the guy that's shouting through the megaphone, right? And then hopefully, I think she likes us, right, the consumer. And then ultimately, you're interested in what people do in terms of buying more of your products for a higher price or using it more frequently. So I'll just give you 2 examples of ways in which I have researched this one, right? I'll put 2 companies that I like. So Starbucks, which now has, 7 outlets just on Badat Street, right? And is competing with Gloria Jeans and Café Dunyas and so forth. So they say if you only focus on short-term returns, then you're going to miss out on a lot of the brand value. So Starbucks is known as a third place. You overpay for coffee there, as you all know, because you want to have the nice, comfortable feeling. I was in the meeting at Starbucks, this is now 11 years ago, where the chief operations officer stood up and said, I have a great plan to save money. We're going to replace the toilet tissue in our restrooms from the comfortable 3-sheet to the 1-sheet you find in airports. And he had calculated that they would save something like $70 million a year worldwide. And it took the marketer, everybody was nodding, to stand up and say, no, people are overpaying for coffee here, right? They're waiting in line. This is the third place. This is the place they come to meet colleagues, to meet friends and family. There's no way we're going to save money on such a small thing and jeopardize the fact that we may lose out in the long-term competition. So you have to have the guts and typically also the numbers to stand up against such initiatives, if you know you're right. Another company I like, EB Games, that was amazing when I went to them. So this is a game company. And they said every person in marketing here was the chief financial officer of another company before. I think it's a unique situation. So we know that it's very important to demonstrate returns. If you ask for a marketing budget of $5 million, then we say, okay, what happens if we take $1 million away? How much less revenue will you make? Right? So they're very rigorous in this one. But they say, we know we lose money. when we use a flight to ship new games to the customer, but it builds our long-term brand value. And so we know that's important for us. How do you typically quantify this? And I typically look at this brand funnel, and I think David had a wonderful example of it too. This is a very generic one. Your own business has a slightly different version of a brand funnel, right? So the idea is that people move through different stages. If you have a long purchase cycle, if you're selling business to business, or if you're selling a car, this is typically months or even years. If you're selling a food product on the supermarket shelves, this could be a matter of days or weeks, right? So people typically, they need to be aware of your product, they need to consider it, they need to prefer it, take some action, and then there's this wonderful loyalty component. So if you look at all the metrics that you can have, and companies will come to you and have lots of metrics for this one, it tends to get pretty confusing, right? Does it matter? So in a paper in the Journal of Marketing Research, I showed, and this is statistically, that knowing these metrics, knowing things like awareness, consideration, and preference, helps you to explain your performance, and this time sales, much better than just knowing your marketing actions. So this chart shows that basically we can explain about 50% of sales by marketing and mindset metrics, as I call them. And about half of that is your own mindset, so what people think and feel about you, and what people think and feel about your competitors. So you get much better able to predict your own sales in the future if you know how people think and feel about you and your competitors. Seems very obvious, but I mean, I've been in Turkey now for 4 years. I've seen most companies not systematically tracking how people think and feel about them. You can also track the wrong metrics. And I love these examples. Continental Airlines, right? They used to track on-time departure. They used to reward people on online departure, and that was in the compensation package of their managers. Of course, it turns out that customers don't care at all about on-time departure. They care about on-time arrival, right? So same thing for Turkish Airlines, right? I really don't care that it's always a huge jam at Atatürk Airport and that we're 7 planes waiting and that we leave half an hour later. I do care if I'm too late in my end destination. Starbucks got completely on the product side, right? They convinced themselves that everybody loves just the product features of coffee as much as they do. So they used to evaluate themselves on the selection of beans in a Starbucks, on the new beverages you bring, the chai lattes and so forth, and on high quality tea. And then, they started doing some research, and it turns out that some customers care a lot about that stuff, of course, but most customers care more about a clean store, friendly staff, and specifically fast service, right? So I live in Jeddah Bostan, and I vastly prefer Café Nero over Starbucks there on the beach. And it's not just because I have a sweet tooth and I love chocolate and so forth. It's because the line is always much longer at Starbucks. And I have a limited amount of time to spend in line. So what did they do in the US, and also in Turkey? I think they have these carts now, right? So you can pre-order your coffee, and you can walk in and just pick it up. So once you know that fast service is more important to most of your consumers than to have a huge selection of beans and a lot of choice, you can do something specific to help you with that one. So it's very important to measure the right stuff when you're doing these metrics. I have a whole methodology which I won't bore you with to come up with these things. But so I find that companies are typically very good to come up with a whole bunch of metrics that could potentially drive how customers feel and think about you. I typically see between 100 and 200 things that people in your company, you look at marketing, you look at your business units, you ask some consultants, I see a huge amount of stuff that could matter in your company. So what I do with my econometric analysis is to boil it down to the few metrics, typically between 10 and 20, that are actually leading sales, that you can see changing before your market share drops, and that are the most important value drivers. So that is the journey that I've been on for the last 5 years in different countries. So just again a few examples, EB Games. So there's some metrics that you can check that are leading your sales and your performance out there. Other ones are lagging. They happen at the same time as your sales changing, or even later on. So EB Games found out that things like consideration, competitive preference, inquiries, trials of their games, that was leading their sales. Whereas things like brand awareness happened after people bought. So in their specific business, they said, well, the fact that brand awareness is down is very interesting for us diagnostically to explain why our sales are down, but it doesn't help us to prevent it because it happens at the same time as our sales are down. Same thing with a major bank. This is First Tennessee Bank in the US. So they found out that their market spending and loyalty scores were very predictive of what was going to happen to their brand, whereas awareness and household retention was not. And none of these things are obviously before you do the analysis. Right? So all of these things could have mattered, but it's thanks to the analysis that you can come up with what is actually most important for my brand and what happens there. As part of a huge project, this is the European Union and Tubitech, I looked at this question across industries in Turkey, in the US, and in Europe. And here are some very interesting thoughts that come from it. The emerging markets here are Brazil, Indonesia, India, and China. So these were industries like personal care, deodorants, medicine, snacks. The one thing that came out as very important was whether people are aware of your advertising or promotion. And no brand experts, including our friend Kevin Keller, will actually tell you that, right? So brand awareness is, if you have an established brand, it's something that don't vary much, right? So let's say brand awareness of Turkish Airlines or Turkcell, let's say it's 99%. And it doesn't change much over time. So it doesn't help you much. Whereas if you ask the simple question, have you seen any advertising or promotion of the brand in the last 6 months? That varies a lot. People report having seen your advertising even if you did not advertise. So it's a measure for how top of mind you are with people, what we found across markets. And so that is a metric that came out as very strong to predict sale in our analysis, and that was completely absent from any kind of other approach that companies used. Consideration or relevance to people and liking our convictions do come out as key drivers of sales. So whether people say they know your brand, but is it relevant to them? And do they like or prefer it? That's very important. But the relative importance depends on which industry you're in and in which country. So if you are in a low involvement product or in a mature market, then how much people love your brand is going to be very important, right? So if you're selling a certain kind of pencil here in Turkey, are you selling, even cell phones in the US? The brand love is extremely important. People have the money to act on their brand love. They consider you because you're in the major retailers, and that's the key driver we find of sales. Whereas consideration is much more important in emerging markets and for high involvement products. So if you advertise something relatively expensive, let's say your product is 500 lira in Turkey, then people will right away notice it if you do your advertising right, but they will first ask all their family and friends. And only if people say, yes, that company has reputation, the brand is basically good quality, only then will people put your brand into their consideration set. And that has a huge impact on whether they will buy you when push comes to shove and they have to make a purchase. So just like we did the same research in China. So Lenovo is, a very key laptop producer. And they got very big in China just on functional attributes, on consideration. In China, Chinese consumers did not have to love Lenovo to buy Lenovo. They're now trying to become big in the States, and they now realize in the States people have to like the brand somehow. So what is the most important sales driver we found was different in, for instance, China versus the US for the same manufacturer. So how important are functional versus emotional attributes, coming to David's presentation, may really much depend on your category and on which market you're selling this in. So this is what we typically find. So our structure is mostly, well, how responsive is a certain mindset metric to your marketing? Can you change it, right? If I say brand preference is very important, but there's no marketing action that you can do to change it, that will be hard. And then to what extent does the mindset metric convert into sales? These are my 2x2s. So for instance, let's say consideration in mature markets, I find it didn't respond so much to marketing and it had a low sales conversion for the brands that I looked at. Whereas liking in mature markets, you can change it with your advertising, and it converts very nicely into sales. And then consideration converts very highly into sales for an emerging market like Turkey. The problem is that your marketing is only part of what gets people to consider it, right? You basically have to stimulate word of mouth in Turkey, and that gets people to put the brand ultimately into the consideration set. It's a huge study, and I can only summarize it in the limited time I have, right? But I put my website on later if you want some more detailed insights. So the message here is it does matter. Brand metrics are important. You can link them to financial value, but you can't just take some study and say, well, it works for this other brand in this other category in this other country, so it will work for my brand in Turkey in this category. People in your company say, well, what about the Turkish situation? And they will be much more convinced if you can do the analysis for your own brands, even if it's imperfect, to show exactly where you should invest in and what that brings in terms of brand value. The final thing, I think I'm the youngest person in the audience, so I have to talk about online stuff, right? So you may have heard in the press and on blogs that a lot of people have said that this purchase funnel is dead. It's completely irrelevant, right? So that this whole awareness, consideration, preference, action, and loyalty is completely irrelevant because people are now going online. For the smallest product, even a paperclip, or for the most expensive products, you know, business-to-business oils, there's YouTube videos now that explain to you how to apply it within your own production facility, right? People just, you know, Google stuff, they search for stuff, and they look at social media online. And so I think McKinsey is one of the most vocal proponents of this one, right? So McKinsey is saying what people do is they have some initial awareness of your product or your brand. Then they go in this active evaluation. They do a lot of stuff online. And they will put brands into their consideration set that were not there before. So that's a key difference. They're saying, you know, it's good that people know your brand name, but if you're very small offline but very big online, you can compensate for that. So it's not a funnel that people narrow things down. They don't start from 10 brands that they're aware of, narrow it down to 5 they consider and so forth. They start from a few, let's say, car brands, and then they look online and they add brands. And that, of course, gives the purchase and then gets back into posting your experiences on social media and you influencing other consumers, right? So one key thing we did this is with a study with Google and JFK in the Netherlands. We said, well, you know, is this really true? Has the old offline funnel of consideration preference, has that lost its relevance? Should we only check the stuff that Facebook and Google give us in terms of fans and so forth? So you have the classic funnel, typically based on offline surveys that your consumers take. And then you have this online funnel that is very interesting, but only based on a few people. You know who's responding to you online, right? Typically the people who are your biggest fans are your biggest haters. And so the question there is, do we get a nice representative overview of our consumers? Does it differ on the product? And can you as a manager do something about this? And so it was a very wide study. So we had 15 categories, cars, internet, energy, travel, but also the typical fast-moving consumer goods like cheese, snacks, and butter, and then tissue and napkins. So a big question is what comes out of this one, right? Is it the fact that people only look for hotel and travel, or do they also look for things like cheese, beer, and brands online? Well, so here was the study, and I don't put up any econometric model, but so we combined everything that the firms did in marketing, so their advertising, their promotion. On the left side, we have this classic funnel, so we had measured awareness, consideration, and so forth. On the right-hand side, we had our online metrics. So people typically speak about paid media, what you have as paid search ads for Google or Facebook. Owned media, how many people come to your website, what do they do there? And then, of course, the earned media. How many social media references do you have? How many people speak positively about you in forums and so forth? And so we had all of these effects on sales and then controlling for the environment. Consumer confidence in the economy, the temperature is very important if you're selling beer and so forth. So this is the overview of the methodology. What we found, very simply, key results. Number one, these new funnel metrics indeed matter. And we found that even for the typical low involvement products, so even if you're selling cheese or snacks in the Netherlands, I would love to do this in Turkey once, right? You have better power to explain your sales if you also know what people say about you online. How many people visit your website? But of course, online is more important if you're into this huge product purchases, right? So durables, cars, and energy. People start looking for cars about 3 to 4 months before they're thinking about buying them. And how many people visit your website, configure a car, and so forth is a huge explanation for your sales 2 or 3 months out. So in high involvement products where more people go online to check out social media and so forth, of course it's more important to check these metrics than for low involvement products. And then finally, suppose you're in a situation where online metrics are very important. We said, well, does that mean that you have to shift all of your marketing money to online marketing, right? So if most people are online and they look for your product, does that mean that offline marketing has no space? And we find, of course, the opposite. That is that things you do with your offline marketing tends to be a huge predictor of how many people go to your website, how many people click on your paid search ads, how many people like your Facebook page, and so forth. So we found that specifically TV ads in all of these categories were pretty powerful in driving online metrics, in driving how many people talk about you and look you up online, which then in turn was very good to predict sales. And the question I typically get then from marketing people is like, how do you do this, right? And we had John's wonderful picture about P&G deodorants up there. So how about I put up a more appetizing picture of a P&G deodorant, right? So this is the Old Spice campaign. So Old Spice was a very old brand. You know, the name says it itself, old-fashioned, had a kind of a sailor image. P&G brought this brand of deodorant and said, well, what can we do to spice things up? It does market research. It turns out that 60% of all male deodorant is bought by women. Right? You buy it for your husband, your boyfriend, maybe your son, right? So they said, well, X has the whole kind of, if you put X on you, then you will attract all the ladies positioning, right? We want to have a position that is much more appealing to women because they control the purse. They buy a lot of the male deodorant. And we want to get a nice conversation between men and women started. So they had this TV ad. Oh, wonderful. Do we have a generator? Oh. So they had this TV ad with this ridiculously handsome guy. He's kind of a B actor called Isai Mustafa. They added during the Super Bowl. And so it was a classical TV ad, but they got so much nice response to it, they put it online on YouTube. And then a famous person started blogging about it. And so then P&G said, let's have this guy answer to the blogs, right? So they got 100 million views, 30,000 tweets about him. And ultimately, they could double their sales in 1 year. And are still going very strong. And I want to put this challenge to your company and saying, can you pull something like this off, right? One of the most amazing